I'm here because a commander, in my judgment, is responsible permanently for his actions, and because, in my case, that responsibility was driven home dramatically by the personal experience through which Musa and I have had to live. My conversion has taken 20 years. In 1968, as commander of the naval forces in Vietnam, I became aware of the fact that the U.S. Army had for 3 years been using Agent Orange, was saving many lives by defoliating the jungles in which our men had to fight the very cunning Viet Cong. The casualty rates in my forces, as I had to put 1,000 small craft into the narrow rivers and canals along the Cambodian border, soared to 6% a month, which meant that the average young man had about a 70% probability of being killed or wounded during his year's tour there. With no data to suggest anything other than complete efficiency and no harmful effects on the Army to date, I chose to use Agent Orange to defoliate the banks of the narrow rivers and canals, and our casualty rates promptly were reduced to less than 1% a month. I therefore conclude that to date it is probably the case that many thousands of lives were saved, although hundreds and hundreds have been affected thereafter. I had firsthand the opportunity to observe how foolish it is to claim that we know exactly where dioxin was used. It's true that the Air Force, in spreading it, retained accurate plots of where those occurred, but Army forces, my Navy forces, procured Agent Orange on the sly in order to destroy foliage around perimeters and around encampments, and there was therefore hundreds and thousands of gallons used for which no record was retained. The best proof that I can offer of the fact that I was unconcerned about the effects on our men was that our own son, Elmo III, commanding one of those 1,000 craft, was one of those heavily exposed. By the 1970s, concerns had begun to be raised with some of the data being collected, and the Congress established that Agent Orange would no longer be used in Vietnam, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, of which I was then one, concluded that the data was suggestive enough of the possibility that we supported that decision. Because we were in the period of latency for cancer on the part of those exposed, and because the data appeared to be so marginal at the time, this became a very remote issue in my mind during the 70s and early 80s. And then in January of 1983, our son Elmo was diagnosed as having both non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and Hodgkin's lymphoma, and by that time had also had 2 children with birth defects. Of our 6 grandchildren, those are the only 2. In our entire ancestry, we have no genealogical history of birth defects. His case, because of the fact that he was exposed by my hand, became a cause célèbre around the country, and there was considerable publicity about it, and we subsequently, in order to reach out to other Vietnam veterans, did the book My Father, My Son, and a movie was produced about that book. And during that entire period, both our son Elmo and I took the position that we were given by government officials that we continued to respect, that there was still considerable doubt as to whether or not there was a direct correlation, and we said that in our public appearances. In 1984, as many of you know, Judge Weinstein presided over a settlement of litigation brought against the chemical companies that produced Agent Orange for $180 million, which at interest by the time of the final distribution was $250 million, spread among the 250,000 veterans who had then applied. It amounted to tips per individual. My closer association with the process began when a good friend, Secretary of Veterans Affairs, Edward Dewinski, asked me, knowing of my background, to do a study for him as a temporary special assistant on the Agent Orange issue. And I then began to dig thoroughly into all the studies and to examine government documents and to talk to many of the government officials who had been associated with this over the years. I became very interested in the works by doctors from Sweden who you have been introduced today, whose studies I thought were definitive. I found that there was much to commend the non-use of the studies done by chemical companies. Subsequently, that has been established in court that some of those studies are absolutely fraudulent, with exposed personnel being put into the unexposed category and vice versa. And yet they have been used as the so-called reference studies for years and years. I became familiar with the fact that the Centers for Disease Control, as a policy matter, had been instructed to fuzz up the results of their studies, to make it very difficult to conclude who was exposed and not exposed, although it is quite clear that we have the capacity to do that. I became aware of the fact that the ranch hand study had been misinterpreted by its authors. About the same time that I reported back to Secretary Derwinski in a study in which I concluded that there were about 27 different diseases that the odds were, as likely as not, were correlated to Agent Orange. There was produced a report by the Agent Orange Scientific Task Force, commissioned by the American Legion and others, which confirmed a very large subset of those same diseases that I had concluded were correlated to Agent Orange. Following the completion of that study, Secretary Derwinski appointed me to be a member of the Committee on Environmental Hazards, whose scientific panel was composed of doctors, including Dr. Yanders, about whom you have heard earlier today at the press conference, representing one of the industrial companies. There were other doctors in that group who had been expert witnesses for the industrial companies. And I became convinced among that committee of what I had reported to Secretary Derwinski, that their process was flawed, that there were biases in that committee, and that the time they were able to devote to their deliberations was simply inadequate for their work to be given any real consideration. I was particularly impressed with their unwillingness to consider the need to go back and review the data of those fraudulent studies conducted by the chemical companies. As I said at the press conference earlier today, I think the good news is that President Bush is the first president we have had who has taken an interest in this issue. His Secretary of Veterans Affairs is the first Veterans Administrator we have had who has taken an interest in this issue. As a result, we do have today a finding that veterans who served in Vietnam and who subsequently have come down with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma will be judged to have a service-connected disability or death. We have a definitive finding that soft tissue sarcoma is correlated, the odds are, to Agent Orange, and therefore benefits provided for that disease. Chloracne, of course. Peripheral neuropathy has recently been added to that list. On the good news side, I would add that by congressional fiat, the Committee on Environmental Hazards has been disbanded, and there has been the assignment of doing the studies has been given to the National Academy of Sciences, and I do not think it is possible for the work to be worse than that was conducted by the Committee on Environmental Hazards. My deep concerns were definitively documented by the hearings of Congressman Weiss and his subcommittee. The very brilliant counsel to that committee, Mark Smolenski, is with you, and he deserves great credit for the outcome. I strongly recommend that you study the record of that hearing, in which it is definitively established that fraudulent work has been conducted on the part not only of industrial companies but also of parts of our government. The most recent months have seen a series of very definitive things coming out to establish the rightness of our cause. Dr. Fingerhut's NIOSH study which has been misinterpreted deliberately by government officials, has in it, when studied carefully, the documentation of our cause. There is an effort going on at the present time to find the need to provide for those veterans who have had diseases occur since the settlement presided over in 1984 by Judge Weinstein. A widow, Mrs. Ivy, brought into the state of Texas a class action making the case that those veterans who had no knowledge of any disease at the time of the previous settlement of a class action could not possibly have chosen to opt out and therefore must be considered as a new class. Interestingly enough, through the Machiavellian efforts of lobbying pressures, that action in the state of Texas without legal precedent was moved into federal court and is being heard by that same Judge Weinstein. The issue being heard is whether or not that was a legitimate action. I believe it will go all the way to the Supreme Court in an effort on the part of the good guys to return that action to the state of Texas, where there is the best chance that those veterans can be heard. But the significant point for your purposes here today is the extent to which pressures get not only into Congress, not only into the executive branch, but also into the third branch of government. Perhaps the most brilliant piece of work done to document all of the studies that have been put together over the years is a deposition prepared by Dr. Kate Jenkins of the Environmental Protection Agency, who is here with you today. I strongly urge you to get a hold of that very long document, which is the best I have seen in analyzing what we now know as a result of all the studies, and it is a devastating case in support of the results of exposure to Agent Orange. I have recently, in an effort to continue to organize the raw, naked power of public opinion, established an Agent Orange Coordinating Council, along with the help of Colonel Dick Christian. We are seeking to bring together all of those agencies that have an interest in the Agent Orange issue and to deal to the extent that we can with limited funds with the immense expenditures of the industrial lobby around Washington. Why are the industrial lobbies continuing to fight this, even though there has been a settlement which apparently released them from responsibility? It is because, of course, as we establish the linkage of exposure to Agent Orange to these diseases, then amongst the civilian population of this country, there will be one more very positive link of proof. And all of the exposure going on in the civilian community will produce liabilities for those same companies, in addition to, of course, the loss of great revenues. So they have a vested interest in winning the case and a vested interest in continuing the fight against us. What is to be done? This seminar is, of course, a very significant step. We must have the data from the fraudulent studies done by the chemical companies resorted and reviewed by competent scientists. We must get into the Vietnamese population and begin to do more definitively the work which Dr. Arnold Schechter has initiated with limited funds, because the Vietnamese population, exposed over much longer periods of time than even our veterans, will definitively produce the kind of data that we need to show the truth of this cause. Congress must continue its investigations. It's the only way to turn over the rocks over those bottom-dwelling slugs in various parts of the executive branch who need to be exposed. We need to continue our efforts to communicate what we know from the operational side and which scientists tend to overlook in doing these studies. Let me give you an example. The data put together by the Veterans Administration showed that for the Marines exposed to Agent Orange in I-Corps, the Marines who served in I-Corps compared to a control group had about 110% more non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and about 57% more lung cancer, whereas Army personnel in I-Corps did not show greatly elevated rates. That comparison has been used to invalidate the merit of the Marine Corps study. In actual fact, those of us that were there there were two significant operational differences that readily explain the difference in those studies. The Marines' concept was to go into the villages, have their squads stay in the villages, live with the natives, eat their food, swim in their rivers, drink their water, whereas the Army concept was to go into the firefight, pull back to the base, go in again for another firefight, and back to the base. So the exposure of the Marines was much greater. In addition, in the I Corps, the logistics personnel were Navy. The Navy were not, of course, examined in that study. In the case of the Army, their logistics personnel were in Army uniform and were included in the study. The logistics personnel in both cases were not exposed. So the effect of the dilution of those logistics personnel did dilute the Army and did not dilute the Marine Corps. So there are two very obvious reasons that have never been picked up in the scientific literature until Dr. Jenkins came along to do so. There are a number of things going on. The state of Michigan has done some very interesting work. George Claxton, who is here, has helped produce Physician's Information booklet for the care of Vietnam veterans exposed to Agent Orange and other chemicals. And incidentally, the state of Michigan is the only place left where veterans can be tested for residual dioxin in the case that any of you have the opportunity to bring that to their attention. Betty Medici, who is here, has formed a birth defects foundation and is in the process of going out with questionnaires which will collect very definitive data on the birth defects of not only Vietnam veterans' children, but other children exposed to other forms of toxic materials. Over time, that will give us the basic data that we need more definitively to prove conclusively what we all know in our gut today, that there are some effects from exposure of the first generation to children of the second generation. Leon Chlorphine Caston is here, who has done a very good book called Lies and Contempt, Dioxin and Agent Orange, not yet published. If anyone can give her a hand in getting that done, it will be an important thing to do. As I said at the press conference, and in summary, we're dealing with the worst form of government ever invented, except for all the others that have ever been tried. We have more and more become government interest groups. The interest group that has most to lose, the industrial lobby, has the most millions to spend, and they are doing so. We have the process of having to grind this solution slowly. It took our government, as I said earlier today, 50 years to correct the wrong that we did to our Japanese Americans in World War II. It took us a quarter of a century to correct the wrong that we did to our veterans, our soldiers exposed to radiation tests in the desert. It took nearly that long to admit that we should not have conducted those involuntary LSD tests on soldiers. It may take a quarter of a century, given the latency period of cancer, to win this case, but we clearly must do so. We must arrange to expose the fraudulent way in which exposures have been graded. We need to constantly remind ourselves, those of us working on the Agent Orange part of the problem, that not only is there a desperate need to correct the wrong being done to these veterans, but that these veterans are just a subset of that much larger problem with which you are dealing today. And they are a very superior laboratory example when the data is properly collected and sorted, as opposed to the system used by our government to date to obfuscate that data. And for the sake of the general population, we need the correct answers of our Agent Orange veterans.